This lesson focuses on our history and experience with the British monarchy and what that experience was that allowed us to incorporate some of those things and put that in our Constitution. So, one of the first things we want to look at is how did we get to where we're going? And I'm going to start with the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth was called the Virgin Queen because she never married, which means she did not have any heirs, which means who's going to rule England? Laws of primogeniture would have said it would have gone to her children. Well, there are no children. So that means it's going to go to one of her brothers or sisters who have all passed away as well. So it's going to be one of her brothers or sisters' children. If that's not happening, then it's going to be an aunt or uncle and their children. So that's exactly what's going to happen in this situation. And all of these experiences with the English monarchy and the building of the parliament and how the parliament limits the monarchy's power is going to influence what happens in our own law that we develop in the United States. So the first person I want to start out with is James I, because he is the person who becomes king after Elizabeth's passing. Now, James I is actually also known as James VI. Confusing, because he was ruling Scotland at the time, and James VI was his name in Scotland. When he becomes King of England as well, his new name is James I, King of Scotland and England combined. And so that's how the naming goes. What's interesting about James I is, yes, Queen Elizabeth did kill his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. And yeah, that did happen. So he does become king when Elizabeth dies. He, when he took over, had a lot of fights with Parliament. He was always wanting more taxes because he wanted to build up his military because he was this big monarch of this great nation. Interesting note, he is the James that founded Jamestown, meaning he financed a colony expedition to the New World with Jamestown. Also, a lot of people didn't like James. And so there was a plot called the Gunpowder Plot, which was to try to assassinate James and get rid of him. And it was carried out by some provincial Catholics. Guy Fawkes would be one that you might know. He had 35 barrels of gunpowder, enough to blow up the whole House of Lords, reduce it totally to rubble. Fawkes was arrested. The parliament was not blown up, and James does remain the king. After James is Charles I, his son, and the parliament struggles continue. And this is the Magna Carta, Charles. And so you are going to be looking at the Magna Carta and seeing those elements of law, of which we have incorporated a lot in our constitutional law. So he did sign the Petition of Right, that Magna Carta, which limited the right of king and gave more power to the parliament. And Charles got more money for his wars. But that was short-lived because after Charles I had it with Parliament and they wouldn't give him any more money, he disbanded Parliament, and of course a civil war broke out. He was caught by people who were for Parliament rule, Parliament power, and he then was executed for treason for not carrying out what he said he was going to carry out. He was replaced by the Lord Protector, who is basically Oliver Cromwell. And if you know your British history, all Cromwells are related, and Thomas Cromwell had a fateful end with Henry VIII, who was Elizabeth's daddy. But anyway, Oliver Cromwell was the Lord Protector. He was the leader of the Puritan army that was part of the parliamentary forces fighting the king at the time. And he won, and the king was executed for treason. He does abolish the monarchy, and he's going to have parliamentary rule. And he, as a Lord Protector, is the leader over all of that, and he will rule as a military dictator. The parliament at the time was known as the Rump Parliament. And I know what you're thinking. The rump is the bump that you sit upon. No other words we're going to use. But rump also means something else. Yes, it's the end of the animal, but it also means the end or the remnant. The remnant is the remaining amount, the remaining people. And so the remnant, these people that fought in the Civil War against the king, formed the parliament. And so the remnant, the Rump Parliament, is what it was known as. They had a lot of Puritan reforms. Remember, Cromwell's a Puritan. And so most of their laws were moral based. So one of them in 1650 was the act to promote godliness, and it was the Adultery Act in May of 1650. And the Adultery Act said, yes, you would be put to death if you committed adultery. Okay, so if you're married and commit adultery, death. Incest was also part of that as well. If you committed incest, you would be put to death. And if you're thinking, oh, I'm not married, this doesn't apply to me. Well, yeah, if you do the nasty, that's called fornication, and you would have 3 months in jail. So remember, that is a Puritan example of trying to reform the nation's morals. We also have religious toleration for the first time during this time period, during the Rump Parliament under Cromwell. And this allowed people to no longer have to go to the Anglican church that was established by Queen Elizabeth. People now could worship in any church they wanted, Anglican, Catholic. It was okay. And so there was no punishment if they did that. So there was no longer compulsory, mandatory attendance at the Anglican church. Well, what's going to happen is the next leader, who should have followed Charles I, his son, Charles II, has been hanging out over in France, and Cromwell is ruling as Lord Protector in England. When Cromwell dies, there's a real crisis of leadership. Who should rule? And the people decide, let's bring back the monarch. And so Charles II comes back from France, and they restore the monarchy after Cromwell's death. Of course, what's the first thing Charles does? He's the absolute monarch, divine right. He dissolves the parliament, but not all bad. Most people were happy with this. They weren't going to wars because Charles liked to live life large. He is also known as the merry monarch, and he did make a lot of merry. He had country dances all over. They were always dancing, and people were always singing, and people liked to go and listen to live music, and they would go to the theater, and they could go and see plays, and they were into blood sports. This part's kind of gross. A lot of cockfighting and bear baiting. That's where you stake out a bear, and then you let animals run around them in a cage, and you watch the bear try to tear them apart. I know, but I guess that was their sports and entertainment. So it was a good time. People were having a good time, and Charles had a good time. He was married. He had 12 children, but none of them were with his wife. So you know where I'm going with this. Who's going to be king, right? Who will be king? So I do need to remind you, during this time period as well, poor Charles had to deal with the Black Plague and the Great Fire of London. So it wasn't all merry. So Charles has 12 children, that is true, but none of them are legitimate. So they can't rule, can't be king, can't be queen. So that means we're going to go to one of Charles's brothers, which brings us to James II. James II was Catholic. And England had been under Puritan Protestant rule for a long time. So we're going to have a lot of upset Protestants thinking that James is going to kill them. And then James is fighting with Parliament again, and it is just not working out. So we have another revolution, but this one is bloodless. They say, James, this isn't working out. Maybe you should step down. And James says, okay, I will. So there were no arms. There were no issues that way. And so he is going to be the last Roman Catholic monarch that Britain has. So that's going to help end a lot of the religious issues with that. So the Glorious Revolution brings in William and Mary. They were offered the throne. Mary was James's daughter, but she's not Catholic. She was raised Protestant, and it is now the beginning of a constitutional monarchy in England. And so there's specific powers that the constitutional monarchs have, and there's specific powers that the Parliament has as a legislative branch, and they share those powers together to run the country. And that's what happens. We then adopt the English Bill of Rights in 1689, And the English Bill of Rights is very similar in many ways to our own Bill of Rights. It has free elections, as we have in our Constitution. It has freedom of speech, which we have in our First Amendment. It has no cruel and unusual punishment, which is in our Eighth Amendment. It has the right to own guns in the Second Amendment of our Constitution. And big one, no taxation without Parliament's consent. You got to have a representative, which is, as you know, one of the battle cries as we go into our own Declaration of Independence. So when you think of that time period of a little over 150 years, English rights for the individual really changed significantly. And those rights you can definitely see in our own Constitution and Bill of Rights.